I'm glad you could join us. Go ahead and stab the like button and stick around for the next untold story. In the sprawling wilderness of Montana's Glacier National Park, Ranger Emma Keller was accustomed to the solitude and unpredictability that came with her job. The rugged terrain, with its majestic peaks and deep forests, was her responsibility, a role she carried out with a mixture of reverence and vigilance. Emma was seasoned enough to respect the untamed nature of her surroundings, yet even she could be caught off guard by the unforeseen. One late autumn evening, as the first hints of frost began to settle on the higher altitudes of the park, Emma received a call about a group of hikers who had failed to return from a trail near Logan Pass. The weather had been clear, but temperatures were dropping rapidly as night approached, increasing the urgency of the situation. Equipped with her emergency pack, a map, and a satellite phone, Emma set out on her ATV, her headlamp cutting through the encroaching darkness. She reached the trailhead just as the last light of day vanished, leaving her under a blanket of stars. Switching to her more powerful flashlight, she began her trek, calling out for the hikers as she moved. The trail was familiar to her, a path she had patrolled countless times, but tonight it seemed different. The usual sounds of nocturnal animals were absent, replaced by a heavy silence that set Emma's nerves on edge. Her calls for the hikers echoed back at her, unanswered. After about an hour of searching, Emma spotted something unusual off the trail. It was a backpack, one of the hikers, abandoned near a bush. Concern heightened, she radioed her position back to the station, her voice steady despite the worry clawing at her insides. Picking up the trail of scattered belongings, a water bottle here, a glove there, Emma followed the signs deeper into the woods, away from the established path. The terrain grew rougher, and the silence was broken occasionally by the crack of a branch underfoot, each sound making her heart jump. She finally came upon a small clearing where the undergrowth was trampled down, signs of a struggle evident in the disrupted soil and foliage. The atmosphere felt charged, the air almost buzzing with an unexplained energy. Emma's flashlight beam caught on something metallic on the ground. It was a camera, its lens shattered. As she bent to pick it up, a sudden movement at the edge of the clearing caught her eye. She whipped around, her flashlight beam crossing over a fleeting shadow that retreated into the darkness. Holding her breath, she listened, but there was no sound of departure, only the ominous feeling of being watched. Fighting the instinct to flee, Emma secured the camera in her pack and continued her search. She needed to find the hikers, but now there was an undeniable feeling of danger that accompanied her every step. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees like silent sentinels observing her plight. Just then, the silence was shattered by a high-pitched scream, a human scream, coming from further up the trail. Emma sprinted towards the sound, her heart pounding in her ears, her mind racing with all the possible scenarios she might encounter. What she found in the next clearing was a scene straight out of a nightmare. The hikers were there, but they were not alone. Amidst them stood a figure, tall and distorted, its features obscured by the darkness. The air around the figure seemed to shimmer, distorting the light, making it difficult to focus on its form. As Emma approached, the figure turned towards her, its eyes catching the light of her flashlight, reflecting it back with an intense, almost blinding luminosity. The hikers were frozen in place, their faces twisted in terror. It was clear that this was no ordinary rescue. Emma had stumbled upon something otherworldly, something that perhaps should not have been disturbed. The story of her night in Glacier National Park was far from over, and the true horror of her encounter was just beginning. Emma's instincts as a ranger kicked in as she assessed the surreal and dangerous situation before her. The ethereal figure remained motionless, its eerie, luminous eyes fixed on her. The terrified hikers, too scared to move or perhaps unable to, appeared trapped in some sort of stupor. Taking a cautious step forward, Emma called out to the group, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Can you walk?" she asked, hoping to lead them away without provoking whatever entity they were facing. There was no response. The hikers stared blankly ahead, seemingly oblivious to her presence. Realizing verbal efforts were futile, Emma slowly approached the nearest hiker, a young woman who seemed the least affected. As she reached out to gently touch the woman's shoulder, the mysterious figure emitted a low, reverberating sound, almost like a growl that resonated through the crisp night air. The forest around them seemed to respond, the leaves rustling despite the absence of wind. The woman blinked rapidly, coming to life under Emma's touch. She gasped for air, as if surfacing from underwater, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Run," she managed to whisper before Emma helped her to her feet. Guiding the woman by the arm, Emma moved towards the other hikers, determined to snap them out of their trance. With each step, the shimmering figure watched but did not follow. It seemed bound to the spot, or perhaps it was merely observing, its intentions cryptic. As Emma reached another hiker, a middle-aged man, and shook him gently, the strange figure suddenly shifted. It stretched taller, and the air around it warped more intensely. Emma realized it was reacting to her actions, perhaps feeding off the fear and confusion present in the clearing. With two of the hikers now conscious and the others slowly coming around, Emma decided they needed to leave immediately. She whispered instructions to the awakened hikers, her voice urgent but calm. "Walk, don't run. Follow me closely." The group began to move away from the clearing, their steps hesitant. Emma kept her flashlight trained on the path ahead, avoiding any direct light on the enigmatic figure, which remained in the clearing, its bright gaze tracking their departure. As they navigated through the dense forest, Emma could feel the figure's gaze on her back, a piercing sensation that made her skin crawl. She urged the hikers to quicken their pace, her own fear mounting with each passing second. They had barely covered 100 yards when a sudden scream erupted behind them. Emma whipped around, her flashlight slicing through the darkness to reveal one of the hikers collapsing to the ground. The rest of the group froze, their faces pale under the beam of the flashlight. Turning back, Emma saw the figure slowly advancing towards them, its form becoming clearer with each step. It was no longer just a shimmering distortion, but a defined entity, humanoid but with features too terrifying to fully comprehend. Its eyes burned a deeper red, and its movements were fluid, like those of a predator stalking its prey. The realization hit Emma hard. They were not merely being observed, they were being hunted. Her heart raced as she faced the undeniable truth that their escape from this nightmare was not guaranteed. The entity from the clearing had marked them, and the boundaries of its domain might extend beyond any of their understanding. With the forest closing in and the spectral figure drawing nearer, Emma knew she had to make a decision: retreat back to the clearing and face the entity on its own ground, or forge ahead, hoping to outrun a force that defied all natural laws. The terror of the situation was palpable, suffocating, as the night in Glacier National Park unfolded into a horror far beyond any tales or warnings ever passed down through the ranks of park rangers. With the spectral entity advancing, Emma realized that outrunning it was futile. The wilderness they had always safeguarded now seemed like a colossal trap, each tree casting ominous shadows that might as well be the outstretched hands of ghosts. "Into the river!" she shouted to the hikers, her voice cracking under the strain. The nearby river, swollen from autumn rains, might offer them a barrier against whatever unnatural force pursued them. Herding the group, she led them toward the sound of rushing water, their way lit only by the faltering beam of her flashlight and the otherworldly glow that seemed to radiate from the pursuing figure. The river's roar grew louder, a sound that was usually comforting to Emma, but now only heightened the sense of impending doom. They reached the riverbank, the water dark and churning. "Get across," Emma commanded, pushing the nearest hiker towards a narrower part of the river. They began to wade into the cold, biting current, struggling against the pull of the water. Behind them, the entity reached the riverbank. Its form halted at the water's edge, and for a moment, Emma hoped it could not cross. The flowing water, perhaps an ancient barrier to such beings. But then, with a terrifying ease, it began to glide over the surface, its body distorting, elongating, as if merging with the mist rising from the river. Panic surged as Emma and the hikers reached the halfway point in the river. The current was stronger than she had anticipated, the water deeper. One of the hikers slipped, pulling in another by their arm. Emma reached out to grab them, her own footing precarious. As she struggled to maintain her balance and help the hikers, she glanced back. The entity had crossed the river, its form now clearly visible on the bank they had just left. Then, it did something none of them expected. It split, multiplying into several forms, each one as terrifying as the last. They began to spread out along both sides of the river, effectively surrounding the group. The entity or entities didn't seem hindered by the natural world's rules. Whether it was the cold, the water, or the wilderness, nothing natural affected them. They were a nightmare made manifest, adapting and overcoming each obstacle with horrifying ease. In a desperate bid for survival, Emma urged the hikers to push forward, to fight against the river's pull. But as they neared the far bank, emerging shivering and soaked on the other side, the figures were already there, waiting with their unblinking, glowing eyes. Emma, exhausted and terrified, realized the grim truth. There was no escaping these beings. They had come from a place beyond her understanding, perhaps from the very shadows of the world, and now they claimed this night. Her final thought, as the entities closed in, was a regretful acknowledgement of her folly in believing humanity was ever truly in control of the wilderness. As the entities converged, the screams of the hikers were drowned out by the roar of the river, the sounds of terror absorbed by the vast, indifferent wilderness of Glacier National Park. The night reclaimed its silence, the dark secrets of the park growing deeper, waiting for the next unwary souls to venture into its depths. Nathan, a park ranger at the remote and rugged Allagash Wilderness Waterway in Maine, was well versed in the challenges posed by the vast stretches of untouched forest and winding waterways. His days were typically spent patrolling the park, ensuring that campers adhered to park regulations and that the wildlife remained undisturbed. It was mid-October, and the park was winding down from the busy summer season. The trees had exploded in a riot of colors, a stunning display that belied the creeping cold of approaching winter. Nathan decided to take one last long patrol route before the park's partial closure, intending to check on some of the more isolated campsites and trail markers. As he paddled his canoe along the river, the chill in the air was biting. The normally soothing sounds of the wilderness, birds chirping, water lapping against the canoe, were muted under a thick gray sky. Nathan felt an unshakable sense of isolation, the weight of the silent forest pressing in around him. He made camp early, as the daylight faded faster than expected under the heavy cloud cover. Setting up his small tent on a riverbank, he gathered wood for a fire. The crackling flames provided a small comfort against the unnerving quiet of the woods. As night fell, Nathan sat by the fire, reviewing maps and planning the next day's route. That's when he first heard the noises, strange crackling sounds, like branches snapping, but rhythmic and deliberate. Initially, he thought it might be deer or some other large animal moving through the underbrush. Grabbing his flashlight, he shone it towards the tree line, but the beam seemed to swallow into the darkness, reflecting nothing back but the dense thicket of trees. The snapping sounds grew closer, circling around his campsite. Nathan called out, announcing his presence as a park ranger, thinking perhaps some campers were wandering off the trail. But the only response was a sudden, intense silence that seemed to thicken the air. Feeling uneasy, Nathan retreated to his tent, zipping the entrance tightly. He tried to convince himself that the noises were just wildlife behaviors he was misinterpreting. Yet, as he settled into his sleeping bag, the silence was abruptly broken by a new sound, a low, mournful wailing that echoed across the river. It was unlike any animal call he knew. It was almost human, a sound of anguish and warning. Unable to sleep, Nathan lay listening as the cry repeated intermittently, each time sounding closer to his campsite. His mind raced with possibilities. Could it be someone in distress? The sound didn't seem natural, and it stirred an instinctual fear within him. As dawn approached, the wailing stopped, but the sense of dread lingered. Nathan emerged from his tent to a gray, foggy morning. The river was eerily calm, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. Deciding he needed to investigate the source of the cries, he packed up his camp quickly. Following the direction from which the wails seemed to have originated, Nathan used his compass to keep a steady course. The forest was thick here, the ground rising into steep, uneven hills as he moved away from the river. The further he went, the more he felt the oppressive silence weigh upon him, a stark contrast to the usual vibrant sounds of the wilderness waking up. After several hours of hiking, Nathan stumbled upon a clearing. The ground was strangely bare, as if scorched by some intense heat. At the center, surrounded by a ring of blackened earth, was an old, weathered backpack. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding. The backpack looked like it had been there for years, exposed to the elements. Yet it was a model that had only recently come into common use. Opening the bag, Nathan found it mostly empty, except for a waterlogged notebook and a broken compass. The notebook's pages were stuck together, but on the last visible page, written in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Do not listen to the crying, it's not human." The discovery sent a chill down Nathan's spine. He realized that he might not be dealing with a simple case of a lost hiker or natural wildlife sounds. The implications of the notebook's warning were unclear, but every instinct told him that the answer lay deeper in the woods, past the clearing and into territory marked as uncharted even on his detailed maps. With the daylight waning and the fog growing thicker, Nathan faced a decision. Venture further into the unknown to uncover the source of the haunting cries, or return to safety, leaving the mystery unsolved but ensuring his own well-being. The silent forest seemed to watch, waiting for his choice. With a deep breath to steady his nerves, Nathan decided to press onward. The mystery of the notebook and the haunting cries that disturbed the night were too compelling to ignore. He felt a responsibility, not just as a ranger, but as someone who had always sought to understand and protect the deeper secrets of the wilderness. Adjusting the straps of his backpack, Nathan stepped beyond the scorched clearing into a section of the forest that seemed even less touched by human presence. The trees here grew close together, their branches intertwining, creating a natural barrier that dimmed the light even further. The ground underfoot was soft, covered in a thick layer of moss that muffled his steps, enhancing the eerie silence. As he ventured deeper, Nathan noticed an increasing number of oddities: trees with their trunks twisted in unnatural shapes, patches of earth that were barren and ash-gray, and a persistent mist that clung low to the ground, refusing to lift despite the growing day. Every sense was on high alert, and he periodically checked his compass, only to find its needle spinning slowly, as if confused by the geography, or perhaps influenced by something unseen. The deeper into the forest he went, the more Nathan felt as though he was being watched. Several times he stopped, scanning the trees around him, half expecting to see something or someone staring back. But there was nothing, only the shifting shadows of the forest. After several hours of hiking, Nathan arrived at a small, hidden valley that wasn't marked on any of his maps. The air here was cooler, and the sound of a distant waterfall reached his ears, a gentle, soothing sound that contrasted sharply with the unnerving stillness of the woods behind him. The valley floor was dotted with wildflowers, a vibrant splash of color in the otherwise muted tones of the forest. It was in this seemingly peaceful spot that Nathan first saw the structure. It was an old cabin, its wood gray and weathered, almost blending into the landscape. It looked abandoned, the windows dark and the door slightly ajar. As Nathan approached, a chill ran down his spine. The cabin had an air of abandonment and decay, but it was what hung from the porch that stopped him in his tracks. A series of small, handmade dolls, each fashioned from twigs and leaves, their faces carved with simplistic yet disturbing expressions. They swayed gently in the breeze, their presence inexplicably sinister. Curiosity overcame his initial hesitation, and Nathan stepped onto the creaking porch to examine the dolls more closely. Each one was unique, but all shared the same twisted smile, eyes empty and staring. It was then that he heard it again, the low, mournful wail that had haunted his night. It was louder here, echoing through the valley, a sound that was definitely human, or so it seemed. Glancing back at the forest, the shadows seemed to grow darker, the mist thicker. The wailing continued, now accompanied by a soft, whispering voice calling from the woods, beckoning him to venture further. Torn between the urge to explore the cabin and follow the voice, Nathan realized that each step took him deeper into a mystery that might have no benign resolution. The forest held its breath, the silence now a palpable force as he contemplated his next move, unaware that each decision brought him closer to truths that might be better left undiscovered. Nathan stood hesitantly on the porch, the wails and whispers intertwining like a chilling melody that seemed to pull at the edges of his sanity. The eerie allure of the cabin and the strange, inviting calls from the woods tugged at him from opposite directions. Deciding the cabin might offer clues, he pushed open the creaking door, stepping into the shadowy interior. Inside, the air was thick with the musty smell of decay. The cabin was sparse, furnished with only a few pieces of decrepit furniture. Dust motes danced in the beams of light filtering through gaps in the boarded windows. His flashlight swept across the room, pausing on a table where a journal lay open, its pages yellowed with age. As Nathan approached to read the handwritten entries, the wailing stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so deep it roared in his ears. The journal was dated several decades back, filled with the ramblings of a person who claimed to be haunted by voices and visions from the woods. The entries grew increasingly erratic, detailing encounters with shadowy figures and lamentations about being unable to leave the valley. The final entry was a frantic plea for forgiveness, signed with a name that Nathan didn't recognize. As he closed the journal, the temperature in the cabin dropped, his breath visible in the icy air. The whispering voices returned, now inside the cabin, swirling around him in a language he couldn't understand. Heart-pounding, Nathan turned to leave, only to find the doorway obscured by a figure, the silhouette of a man, tall and impossibly thin, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. Frozen in place, Nathan could only watch as the figure advanced toward him, its movements unnaturally smooth. The whispering grew louder, now a cacophony that filled the cabin, echoing in Nathan's mind. He tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't respond, his entire body paralyzed by an overwhelming dread. The figure reached out with a hand that seemed more shadow than substance, and as its fingers brushed against Nathan's arm, a rush of images flooded his mind, visions of the valley's dark past, the suffering of lost souls, and the endless cycle of entrapment that had claimed so many before him. Nathan realized in that terrifying moment that the cabin and the valley were a nexus for something ancient and malevolent, a place where physical and spectral realms collided. As the figure's grip tightened, the voices crescendoed into a deafening scream, and Nathan felt himself being pulled toward the figure, the cabin, and the dark heart of the valley. His last conscious thought was a desperate hope that his disappearance might go unnoticed, preventing anyone else from seeking him out and falling prey to the same horrific fate. The next morning, the cabin stood silent and empty, the handmade dolls swinging gently in the breeze on the porch, as if nothing had occurred. The journal lay open on the table, dust settling upon it undisturbed. The forest around the valley resuming its eternal watch, waiting for the next unwary soul to enter its depths. Ranger Emily Stanton had been overseeing the sprawling expanse of the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge in Oklahoma for nearly 5 years. Known for its rugged terrain, the refuge was a sanctuary for countless species and a haven for hiking enthusiasts. Emily's experience made her well-equipped to handle the myriad challenges of park management, but nothing could have prepared her for the peculiar events that began in late November. It started with reports from hikers about strange noises during the night, sounds that didn't match the typical wildlife calls familiar to the area. Descriptions varied from deep, guttural growls to an almost mechanical grinding, unlike anything heard before in the refuge. Emily initially thought it might be pranksters with sound devices trying to scare other visitors, but the reports became too consistent and were made by seasoned hikers whom Emily trusted. Compelled to investigate, Emily set out one crisp winter evening to camp near the area where most of the sounds had been reported. Her destination was a secluded part of the park, known as Devil's Canyon, due to its steep cliffs and deep, shadow-filled crevices. The area was beautiful by day, but it took on a sinister feel as dusk fell and shadows melded into darkness. As night enveloped the canyon, Emily sat by her small campfire, listening to the natural sounds of the evening. Owls hooted in the distance, and the occasional rustle of small mammals in the underbrush punctuated the stillness. Everything was normal until midnight approached. First came a silence, a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to smother all natural sounds. Emily felt a chill that wasn't entirely due to the cold air. She grabbed her flashlight and scanned the area around her campsite, but nothing appeared amiss. Then, without warning, the silence broke with a startling clarity. A loud, harsh, grinding sound echoed through the canyon, as if massive stones were being ground together deep within the earth. Startled, Emily stood up, her hand instinctively going to the radio at her belt, ready to call for backup if necessary. But before she could press the button, another sound layered on top of the grinding. a low, mournful wail that reverberated off the canyon walls. It was unlike any animal she knew, and it struck a primal fear into her heart. Gripping her flashlight tighter, Emily decided to trace the source of the sounds. With every step, the noises grew louder and more distinct. She followed a narrow trail that wound its way up the side of the canyon. The moon, nearly full, cast just enough light for her to see by without constantly using her flashlight, saving the battery for when she really needed it. As she climbed higher, the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, and a faint mist began to form around her, unusual for this time of year. The vegetation seemed to wither before her eyes, the life draining out of plants as she passed by, leaving them gray and twisted. Finally, Emily reached a vantage point where she could see into a deep crevice below. The sounds were clearly emanating from this pit, a dark opening in the earth that seemed to swallow any light that touched it. As she shone her flashlight into the abyss, the beam flickered erratically and then went out, despite the new battery she had inserted before leaving camp. With her heart pounding in her chest, Emily felt the cold mist thicken around her, and the grinding noise intensified, as if something was climbing out of the crevice. The mournful wail sounded again, closer this time, filled with an urgency that sent a shiver down her spine. She was about to turn and make her way back to the campsite when a figure appeared at the edge of the crevice, silhouetted against the moonlight. It was tall, impossibly thin, and seemed to be looking right at her. Frozen in place, Emily realized that the refuge held secrets far older and more mysterious than any records told. Her training had prepared her for natural threats, storms, fires, even the occasional lost hiker, but nothing in her career had ever hinted at something like this. As the figure began to move towards her, its movements jerky and unnatural, Emily knew the story of what lurked in Devil's Canyon was far from over. The night had just begun, and survival was now her only goal. As the silhouette approached, Emily's initial shock morphed into a desperate need for action. Her training as a ranger hadn't prepared her for this, but her instincts as a survivor kicked in. She backed away slowly, not wanting to turn her back on the figure. Each step was cautious, her eyes locked on the looming shape that seemed to glide rather than walk, its movements eerily smooth against the rugged terrain of the canyon. The figure halted momentarily, and in that brief pause, Emily's flashlight flickered back to life, casting an intense beam directly onto the figure. The light revealed not a creature of flesh and blood, but something else entirely, something ethereal. Its body appeared semi-translucent, shimmering with an internal light that pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat. Its eyes, deep and dark, reflected the light from the flashlight, giving it a spectral quality. Realizing that confrontation was inevitable, Emily took a deep breath and called out, "Who are you? What do you want?" Her voice echoed in the canyon, the sound bouncing off the walls before settling into a tense silence. The figure remained motionless, and for a moment, Emily wondered if it had understood her words. Then, it spoke, or rather, the air around it vibrated with sound, forming words that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Guardian, here, boundaries, not human. The words were disjointed, barely making sense, yet they carried a warning that was clear. Emily, though terrified, felt a duty to understand more. She asked again, "Are you protecting something here? Are we in danger?" The figure resumed its approach, its voice resonating through the chilly air. "Disturbance. Must cease. Leave. Safe." It was a warning, but also an ultimatum. Emily understood then that she was dealing with something ancient, perhaps as old as the mountains themselves. She remembered legends told by local tribes, stories of spirits that guarded sacred lands, stories she had always assumed were metaphors, rather than actual warnings. Deciding that retreat was her best option, Emily slowly began to withdraw, keeping her eyes on the figure as she moved. As she retreated, she noticed the temperature dropping, the air growing denser, a fog enveloping her path, making navigation difficult. Her retreat was slow, her body tense for any sudden movements from the figure. As she neared the edge of the canyon, where the path led back to her camp, she heard the figure one last time. Remember, not return. Sacred. Reaching the safety of the path, Emily turned and ran. She didn't stop to look back until she was well away from the canyon, her lungs burning with the cold air, her legs aching from exertion. When she finally paused, gasping for breath, she looked back towards Devil's Canyon. The fog was thicker now, obscuring the deep crevice from view, and the figure was nowhere to be seen. Heart still pounding, Emily made her way back to her campsite. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint, warm glow in the near darkness. She packed up her gear with shaking hands, her mind racing with what she had encountered. Every sound in the forest now seemed ominous, every shadow a hiding place for unknown spirits. As she loaded the last of her gear onto the ATV, the gravity of the night's events weighed heavily on her. The wilderness she loved and protected had revealed its deeper, hidden layers, and she knew her experience at Devil's Canyon would haunt her for a long time. The drive back to the ranger station was long and silent, the sounds of the night forest seeming to whisper secrets she was only beginning to understand. The story of Devil's Canyon was far from over, and Emily knew that her encounter with its guardian spirit would be just the beginning of a larger, more complex narrative that would unfold in the shadows of the Wichita Mountains. As Emily sped away from Devil's Canyon, the overwhelming fear began to ebb, replaced by an urgent need to document everything that had transpired. She knew that understanding what she had encountered might be critical, not just for her own peace of mind, but for the safety of others who might venture into that secluded part of the park. Reaching the ranger station well after midnight, Emily locked herself in her office and began to compile her notes. She sketched the figure from memory, its shimmering, translucent form burned into her mind's eye. She transcribed every word it had communicated, trying to parse the meaning behind the fragmented sentences. The station was silent, the usual night staff absent, giving her solitude to reflect and work uninterrupted. But as she immersed herself in her work, a creeping sensation began to take hold. The station, normally a place of refuge and safety, felt unnervingly still. The typical sounds of the building settling, the distant calls of nocturnal animals, were absent tonight, as if the world outside had been muted. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, the static breaking the silence sharply. Emily jumped, her heart racing as she listened. A voice came through, weak and distorted. "Ranger, assistance, Devil's Canyon." The transmission was garbled, cutting in and out, but it was unmistakably a call for help. Grabbing her radio, Emily responded, trying to obtain clearer details, but there was no reply, just a return to oppressive static. Her instincts screamed that this was related to her earlier encounter. Had someone ventured into the canyon despite the warnings? Was this a residual effect of the spirit's presence? Without hesitation, Emily grabbed her gear and headed back out into the night. The drive back to Devil's Canyon was tense, the road seemingly darker and more foreboding than before. When she arrived at the trailhead, the same eerie silence greeted her, but now it was laced with a sense of imminent dread. She made her way down the trail, flashlight piercing the darkness, calling out for the person who had radioed for help. As she approached the entrance to the canyon, the air grew inexplicably colder, her breath visible in the beam of her flashlight. Then, she heard it again. The mournful wailing that had haunted her before, louder and more sorrowful than before. Emily pressed forward, determined to find the source. But as she stepped into the clearing where she had first encountered the spectral figure, the ground beneath her suddenly felt unstable. Without warning, the earth gave way, a hidden sinkhole swallowing her whole. She fell into darkness, the cold air rushing past her as she plummeted. The fall seemed to last forever, a terrifying descent that ended abruptly as she hit water. Submerged in a frigid underground river, Emily struggled to reach the surface, her limbs numb. When she finally emerged, gasping for air, she found herself in an underground cavern, the walls aglow with a strange phosphorescence. The spectral figure was there, waiting, its glowing eyes the only source of light in the overwhelming darkness. It moved toward her, the same disjointed words echoing around the cavern. Boundaries, broken, consequences. Emily realized too late that her return had sealed her fate. The Guardian's warning had been clear, and her intrusion had triggered a dire consequence. As the figure reached her, its touch cold and unyielding, Emily felt a deep chill spread through her body, her strength ebbing away. Above, the sinkhole remained a silent testament to her disappearance, the eerie wails of the Guardian echoing through the canyon, a chilling reminder of the ancient forces guarding Devil's Canyon. The station's radio continued to crackle static into the empty night, the unanswered calls for help slowly fading into silence, as if the canyon itself was swallowing the sounds, ensuring that its secrets remained shrouded in mystery and terror. Thank you for listening. Now watch this video.